A naive college student is in for a surprise as he spends a week at his girlfriend's house, unaware of how bizarre each family member can be. A flight attendant announces that the aircraft is starting its final descent to Quebec City Airport. Sitting at the back of the plane, a young college student named Michael writes his thoughts in his journal as he relives his memories of his girlfriend at the beach. He says he used to like many girls before but eventually fell for Gabby. Unfortunately, she abruptly left college mid-semester to care for her sick grandmother, but she didn't even say goodbye to him, so he didn't know where their relationship stood. Just as the young man lost hope that they would still see each other, she unexpectedly invited him to her house for Christmas, thinking of fixing their relationship and finally meeting her family. Michael excitedly looks forward to the upcoming week. As the plane arrives at its destination at the airport, a group of workers puts up a mural of the Three Graces painting. As Michael walks and stops in front of the wall, setting his bags down, he patiently waits for the vacation host to pick him up. Hours pass, people in the airport thin out, and the workers even finish their wall work, but the young man still waits alone. Finally, Gabby arrives at the airport and smiles as she sees her guest from afar. Meanwhile, Michael looks down, exhausted and sadly disappointed, just as the young woman covers his eyes from behind and playfully asks him to guess who. He happily says Gabby's name, and the two kiss tenderly before heading outside. Moments later, the two arrive at Gabby's huge French mansion. She mentions they're having issues with the lights, so the candles are the only source of light inside. They then celebrate the reunion with a passionate kiss, but her mother, Mrs. Dyer, catches them in the act with a disapproving look. The woman greets Michael as her daughter formally introduces the visitor. Suddenly, their dog Beowulf barks at the new face, so Gabby introduces him to the guest. However, the young woman's sister calls for her from the kitchen, so she leaves the guest with her mother. Using candles, Mrs. Dyer guides the visitor through the dark hallway. As they walk to the kitchen, they hear a man singing, and the woman tells him it's her husband cooking their dinner. Surprised by the unusual scene, Michael is taken aback when he sees Mr. Dyer, who is only wearing a towel from the waist down. Gabby then kisses her father's cheek before introducing the young man to him. At the dining table, Father Walter prays alone silently, but the patriarch mocks him, quoting a famous physicist named Blaise Pascal, as he finds the religious act pointless. Annoyed, the priest looks at him disdainfully, as Mrs. Dyer sits across from him, while the three sisters join them at the table. Gabby shares that their father is writing a book about the said physicist. However, he claims that he can only work without his clothes on. Giggling, her youngest sister, Simone, tells the visitor that their father is an atheist. Their mother, a devout Catholic, scolds her, saying she shouldn't joke about beliefs, especially in front of a priest. Father Walter then agrees, stating that her lack of respect doesn't surprise him, as her father also mocked his faith earlier. Unbothered by the priest's comment, Mr. Dyer entertains Michael instead, inviting him to sit at the table. Not knowing where to sit, the visitor awkwardly sits beside Father Walter, making the priest uncomfortable. Just then, the free-spirited writer discusses aircraft machines with him. Fortunately, the lights turn back on, and everyone at the table smiles and cheers as they get relief from the darkness. After fixing the electricity, Nick, the resident handyman, enters the room through a hidden door on the wall. He kisses his girlfriend, Gabby's older sister Irina, as he sits beside her. Mr. Dyer then leads the family tradition of holding everyone's hands up high and loudly chanting, "Bon appetit," together before eating. As the group eats, Michael tries to connect with Mrs. Dyer by sympathizing with her ill mother's condition. Hearing her mother's name, the woman abruptly gets up from the table and rushes to the next room. Her daughters and Father Walter closely follow her in concern, leaving Nick, Michael, and Mr. Dyer awkwardly at the table. A few minutes later, the visitor listens to the conversations in the living room. He learns that Mrs. Dyer is upset because her mother didn't recognize her when she visited her in the hospital. Later that night, Michael and Gabby finally get a moment to themselves and play a board game together. Suddenly, the woman tells him she isn't in love with him anymore. Dismayed, he tries to convince her they need more time to reconnect as he's just arrived at their house. But she heartlessly tells him she doesn't think spending more time together will make any difference. Feeling pissed off, the young man follows her as she tries to go to bed. He argues that she gave him hope that their relationship would work out, so he has a right to be upset that they're breaking up. Upstairs, Mrs. Dyer overhears the two arguing and calls her daughter into her bedroom. She reprimands her for bringing the visitor into her room, thinking they'll have an intimate evening together. Meanwhile, Michael leans his ear against the door, listening to the discussion inside. However, as he looks to his left, he shockingly sees Irina undressed, casually grabbing a towel from a rack in the hallway. Stunned, he tries to accustom himself to the family's careless and eccentric behavior. The following day, as Mrs. Dyer and Michael walk together to church, she tells him that she declined Father Walter's marriage proposal before he became a priest. Her 3 daughters then pray in the pews with her while the visitor, a non-believer, observes them. Afterward, the sisters bid Simone and Mrs. Dyer goodbye as they plan to visit their grandmother in the hospital. At the mental hospital, the visitor walks behind Gabby, Irina, and Nick and accidentally bumps into a bed where Granny lies. To his surprise, she calls out his name, making the guests react excitedly, thinking she knows him from Gabby's stories. But her granddaughter holds her back, saying the young man before her is not her Michael. Confused, the visitor asks Nick about what happened. He reveals that Granny has dementia, thinking that she is living her life 20 years ago. She also believes that he is her long-deceased husband, who is also named Michael. After their visit, Gabby gets heartbroken because the old woman no longer recognizes them. She also shares with the visitor that their grandmother is already dying, but their mother is in denial over this, which makes her sad. To comfort Gabby and prevent her from getting cold, he tries to put his gloves on while telling her to calm down, but she rejects his efforts, telling him to leave her alone. That night, Michael joins Nick in the shed for a drink. The handyman recounts his experiences, concluding that Gabby is just toying with the young man's emotions. In denial, Michael tries to correct his assumptions, but Nick tells him that he knows the family well enough to understand what he's going through. He also confesses that he plans to leave and train to be a pilot, asking the visitor to keep it a secret. Later, as Michael sleeps in his room, Irina sneaks in and wakes him up. Lying beside him, she assures him that her sister likes him, then she whispers that she doesn't want him to leave. Leaning in to kiss him softly, but before the kiss can lead to anything more, she instructs him to leave Gabby's gift in her bedroom. The next morning, before slipping out of his room, he silently tiptoes toward Gabby's bedroom. Just as he sets the gift down, the birthday girl wakes up and invites him to cuddle. Michael quickly crawls into bed, and as he takes his shirt off, she rests her head on his chest. However, Mrs. Dyer happily makes her way to Gabby's bedroom to leave her present. Shocked to find the shirtless young man in her daughter's bed, she gives him a piercing look and slams the door shut. Alarmed, Gabby hurries after her mother to explain herself. Moments later, Michael and Gabby spend the rest of the day together in town. Returning to an empty house, she invites him to her bedroom. But as they become entangled in a passionate embrace, she gets a call from her mother asking her to turn off the oven downstairs. Wearing only her underclothes, Gabby goes downstairs to do as she's told while Michael, barely dressed, playfully chases after her. However, as she reaches the kitchen, she's met with a surprise birthday party. Her family and guests, including priests and nuns, cheerfully welcome her. Fortunately, Michael's still a few seconds behind her and quickly retreats, sneaking outside. Moments later, he finds refuge in a bathtub tucked away in a dark corner of the sisters' bathroom. As he sips some wine, Simone unexpectedly enters the room and adjusts her undergarments. The visitor tries to hide by holding his breath underwater but tragically fails. Startled, she curses him out, thinking he intentionally waited for her. As the party ends, Michael drunkenly scatters and dances his way into Gabby's bedroom. He smiles excitedly, thinking they'll finally resume their postponed romantic evening, but his excitement fades as she sends him away. Frustrated, he decides to sleep in his room instead. However, at midnight, Simone sneaks into his bed, misinterpreting what happened in the bathroom earlier. He tries to send her back to her room, but fails. Exhausted, the visitor opts to sleep in the hallway, but with Beowulf taking over the armchair in the area, he settles on the floor to sleep instead. The next day, Michael, Gabby, Irina, and Nick visit Granny in the hospital only to discover she's missing. Thankfully, a roommate informs them that the old woman escaped to her country estate in search of her husband. The group then travels upstate to search the dilapidated mansion but finds no sign of her. After Michael lights the fireplace in the living room, he joins Gabby and Irina in searching the grounds outside. They decide to split up to cover the snowy landscape more quickly. The young man stumbles through the twigs and trees, repeatedly calling out for the old woman. Lost in the woods, he slips and falls into a hole. Unable to escape, he calls out, hoping to find the source of the approaching footsteps. To his surprise, Granny appears, happily calling out his name. As night falls, Michael and Granny return to the house. The old woman warms herself in the old study room as he stokes the fire, drenched in sweat. The young man patiently helps the woman slowly remove her wet clothes. As he does, she speaks to him as if he's her husband. He tries to correct her at first but eventually decides to play along. He even cuddles the cold woman as she recounts her married life. Later, the sisters return, disappointed after failing to find Granny. However, their spirits lift when they see her sitting on the couch with the visitor. To celebrate, Michael and Gabby make out on the couch as they get away from the others, but the woman quickly breaks the moment, reiterating that she's sure she doesn't love the young man anymore. Irina further interrupts them, inviting her sister upstairs. Frustrated, the visitor rolls off the couch and bangs his head on the floor before heading upstairs to sleep. Upstairs, Granny sleeps in the bed while Michael lies on the floor between Gabby and Irina, with Nick already asleep. The old woman, surprisingly awake, tells them a story about her lost summer shoes. When Gabby sits beside her, the old woman apologizes for escaping, explaining that she only wanted to come home one last time. Later that night, the visitor warms himself by the fire downstairs. When Irina sees him drinking water, suddenly the woman approaches and kisses him, leaving him hanging before kissing him again, only to tell him she's going to bed. Irritated by repeatedly being left hanging, frustrated by the sister, Michael storms into the cold night to blow off steam. The following morning, Mr. Dyer arrives with Simone and Beowulf at the estate, and the sisters joyfully greet them. Inside the house, the father tells his daughters that he'll take them skiing. However, Gabby wants to take their grandmother back to the hospital. Being the family's errand boy, Nick tells her to stick with their plan. He states that he and the visitor will take the old woman back instead. As the Dyers leave for their trip and Nick and Simone fuel the truck, Michael's alone with Granny in the mansion. Outside, he writes Gabby's name in the snow but crosses it out before finishing, signifying that he's over her. Suddenly, on the tree beside him, he notices a bag hidden in the trunk, covered in snow. Finding a pair of elegant summer shoes inside, he remembers Granny's story about her lost shoes. He rushes inside to confirm if they're hers. However, as he goes upstairs, the old woman isn't in her bedroom. Panicked, Michael runs outside calling out Granny's name. As he passes by a crumbling chapel, he hears a song playing softly on an instrument. He then finds the old woman inside, sitting alone and rummaging through her old belongings. When he enters the chapel, Granny spots her summer shoes in his hands. Grateful, she thanks him for finding them and asks him to keep them for her. The old woman, a believer, tells him he's missing out by not believing in God. Still thinking he's her husband, she asks him to make sure she'll wear a well-pressed dress at her funeral. Tearfully, he agrees, promising to keep her husband's word as they share a heartfelt hug. Later, as Nick and Michael drive Granny to the hospital, Nick sadly admits he has broken up with Irina. Meanwhile, the old woman dreams of a younger version of herself walking through her mansion as she closes all the curtains in the living room. In her dream, she becomes too cold and loses consciousness. In real life, even as Nick tries his best to reach the hospital in time, Granny unfortunately slips away as she exits the door in her dream, symbolizing her peaceful passing. Michael, devastated and desperate, attempts to resuscitate her, but despite his efforts, she's gone. At Granny's funeral, the women in the family pay their respects to the old woman as they pray for her together. The visitor looks at them close by and then focuses on Granny, keeping his word. He eyes her dress, making sure that it isn't crumpled as she peacefully lies in her casket. As everyone goes home after Granny's burial, Irina invites the young man to her art studio, claiming there's an art piece she must show him. However, it turns out the woman has a different intention, and the two share a private moment. Afterward, on Christmas Eve, Michael helps Gabby clean the table after dinner. He avoids making eye contact and keeps his distance from her. Nervously, he tries to deny that he got intimate with Irina in her art studio, but Gabby tells him he didn't have to lie about it, as her sister had informed her of the plan in advance. Relieved, the young man relaxes and smiles at her as the electricity suddenly goes out. In the morning, the family is busy happily opening their Christmas presents, including the ones from the visitor. Nick left the mansion as he had planned. Then, the young man hurries to go outside as the family unwraps Father Walter's gift of a large portrait of a young woman to Mrs. Dyer. As his vacation nears its end, he visits Granny alone, bringing a bouquet. Surprised, he finds a beautiful blonde woman standing by the grave. At first, he denies knowing Granny to the stranger, who decides to walk away instead. But before she can walk away any further, Michael admits that he knew Granny and loved her in his own way. The blonde woman then unexpectedly kisses him before she walks away. That night, Michael goes downstairs to get a glass of water, only to find a bare Mr. Dyer at his study table. He invites him to sit and tells him he still feels Granny's presence, pointing at the frame. He confesses that the portrait of a young Granny, which Father Walter gifted his wife that day, amplifies the otherworldly feeling. The young man then shockingly recognizes the image as the stranger who kissed him in the cemetery. Despite realizing that what happened earlier was a supernatural event, he is grateful to have learned to truly love Granny. He's found a form of true love despite chasing the wrong kind of love all week from the sisters. The next day, Gabby, Irina, and Simone accompany Michael to the airport for his flight home. Each sister then hugs him and bids him goodbye, with his ex-girlfriend saying that she's not going back to college. As he reminisces, he concludes that his favorite memory from his trip was when Granny talked about God in the ruined chapel. The memory gives him a foundation of faith that he can nurture in the future. In the end, Michael clutches onto Granny's summer shoes, knowing she'll always be with him wherever his journey takes him. As he parts with the sisters, the three graces painting on the airport wall mirrors the three women. The mural serves as a reminder of his failed romantic attempts, symbolizing the elusive nature of idealized love, much like the struggles he faced throughout his journey. Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.